Good morning. The committee will come to order. We're meeting this morning to receive testimony on the legislative discussion draft entitled the Wildfire Budgeting, Response, and Management Act. And I want to thank those who joined together when we released this draft, May 25th, along with ranking member Senator Cantwell. But Senator Wyden, you and Senator Crapo have been working this issue for a very long time. We thank you for your leadership. Senator Risch joined us. So a good, strong team with this draft. We've taken public comments on it. We're taking the next step today because I think we recognize that we face some serious challenges in an area that needs to be addressed. People across the country are realizing that wildfires are a growing crisis. We certainly know in Alaska the devastation that wildfires bring to our state. About half of the 10 million acres that burned last year were in Alaska. We've already seen over 200 fires this season alone. So there's a recognition that it's a real problem, it's a growing problem, and resolving it will require a comprehensive approach that addresses both wildfire funding and forest management. We need to do both at once because we know the wildfire problem is not just a budgeting problem, it's also a management problem. Now, I've worked through the appropriations process to provide temporary fixes to ensure that our firefighters and forest managers have the resources that they need. I added $1.6 billion for wildfire suppression to last year's omnibus, $600 million above the average cost over the past 10 years, likely enough to prevent fire borrowing this year. Last year's bill also included targeted increases in hazardous fuels reduction and timber programs that will help mitigate wildfire hazards and keep our forested rural economies going. It was just last week, actually now it was closer to 2 weeks ago, that we reported the Interior Appropriations bill for the next fiscal year. It again includes full funding for wildfire suppression as well as substantial commitment to prevention and forest management efforts. And I'm proud of that work, but I will also be among the first to say that our yearly appropriations bills are just temporary solutions. They get us from one year to the next, designed to hold us over as we develop longer-term solutions. And a longer-term solution is what we have in front of us today. Our draft bill includes a fiscally responsible fix to permanently end the destructive practice of fire borrowing. This is where agencies raid non-fire programs like recreation, wildlife, and timber to pay for firefighting. Our fix requires Congress to provide resources to the agencies up front, enough to cover 100% of the average annual cost of firefighting over the past 10 years, while allowing for a limited cap adjustment in those truly catastrophic fire years. In low fire years, we allow the agencies to invest leftover suppression funds in prevention projects. Ending fire borrowing is something that members on and off the committee have called for. This is not just a Western issue. Just this week, Senator Schumer complained that fire borrowing takes federal dollars away from efforts to fight the emerald ash borer and other invasive species in New York. Undersecretary Bonney told this committee last year that fire borrowing has significant and lasting impacts across the entire Forest Service, not to mention its negative impacts on local businesses and economies. Yet despite widespread agreement that we need to end this unsustainable practice, the administration is not yet willing to embrace our bipartisan proposal to do just that. Instead, it insists that Congress should fund just 70% of the 10-year average of suppression costs. A proposed cap adjustment would pay for the rest, as well as any costs above the 10-year average. Congress has rejected this idea every year that it's been proposed. The administration claims that it will use the difference between 70% and 100% for forest restoration and other measures that allow you to get ahead of the problem. But regrettably, the President's budget request for the Forest Service simply does not bear this out. Using the 70-30 split, the Forest Service would move about $273 million off budget next year. But the administration does not seek to plus up wildland preparedness or vegetation and watershed management. Those accounts are flat. It did not seek to increase forest health management on federal lands. That request is actually down. Both National Forest System budget and the Forest Service overall budgets are down. This just doesn't comport with the reality here. So you can begin to see why wildfires are also a management problem. Healthy, resilient forests are fire-resistant forests, and yet despite knowing the value of fuel reduction treatments in mitigating wildfire risks, increasing firefighter safety, and restoring the health of our forests, active management is still often met with a series of discouraging and sometimes insurmountable obstacles. High upfront costs, long planning horizons, and difficult regulatory requirements are impeding our ability to implement treatments at the pace and scale that wildfires are occurring. Our discussion draft would take steps to reduce these hurdles without abandoning important environmental protections by building on authorities within the existing Healthy Forest Restoration Act. We focus and expedite environmental reviews by limiting the number of alternatives that need to be analyzed for collaboratively developed projects, including those contained in community wildfire protection plans. Our bill also pilots a new emergency environmental assessment for native ponderosa pine forests, which are highly susceptible to burning, in order to reduce the risk of the large, destructive, and expensive wildfires that are unfortunately becoming the norm. Addressing the management problem would not be complete without attention to our nation's largest national forest, and that's the Tongass in southeast Alaska. And when it comes to the Tongass, I think we recognize that there's not always going to be agreement, but I hope that we can at least agree that the transition to a program focused on predominantly young growth timber needs to be real and not just something that looks good on paper. The Forest Service needs to do what's right and undertake what the Tongass Advisory Committee, the TAC, called for in its recommendation. And they called for a comprehensive stand-level inventory to address the uncertainties that exist in the supply, volume, and timing of the available of young growth to support a transition. On January 21 of this year, the TAC reiterated the importance of an inventory, calling it the #1 priority investment, because modeling is not good enough for a clear picture of when young growth will come online. A successful transition will only be possible if it is grounded in strong science and backed by comprehensive data. The point of our Tongass provision in this draft is not to delay the transition that is already underway, but to allow for a meaningful inventory to take place before the land plan is amended. The last thing that I want to highlight is our emphasis on federal engagement with state and local fire agencies and other partners. This is critical to mitigate risk to communities and to manage and respond to wildfires. The investments we authorize will help communities become fire adapted, which is an important piece of the solution to escalating wildfire suppression costs in the wildland-urban interface. I'd like to close by thanking my colleagues for working with us on this discussion draft. I intend to advance it to the Senate floor as soon as possible, and I would hope that members of our committee will recognize what's at stake here and join me in the effort.